When Rav died, his students followed behind him to bury him. When they returned, they said, "Let's go eat bread by the Danak River." After they prepared their food, they sat and wondered, when the Mishnah uses the term reclining in order for one person to make a bracha on behalf of the rest, does it literally mean only reclining? And if they're merely sitting together, each person has to make his own bracha? Or perhaps once the group has said, "Let's go eat bread in a certain place together," it's legally the same thing as reclining. They did not know the answer. Rav Ada bar Ahava got up, turned around his torn cloak, which he had torn at Rav's funeral, and tore the front of the garment again. He said, "Rav is gone, and we haven't even learned how to make brachot on food." I thought about this story, which is from the 6th chapter of Masechet Brachot, as we were about to start the Seder here in our house in Ramat Beit Shemesh. I'd gotten up from sitting Shiva for my father, Bob Kahn, 3 days earlier. As the Seder began, we sang Kadesh Urchatz, as we always did. And then it was time for Kiddush. Now in my family, we sit for Kiddush, except for the first night of Sukkot when we stand until we make the bracha Leishev Basukah. Every other Shabbat and Yom Tov, our family custom is to sit. Or is it? What about the first night of Pesach? We sit, right? Or on this night, do we also stand, just as we do on the first night of Sukkot? I'm pretty sure we sit, but what did my dad do? So we sat, which I think was correct, but I wasn't really sure. And as we said Kiddush, I couldn't help but think, my dad is gone, and I don't even know how to make Kiddush. I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. It's the little things that hit the hardest. The big moments when I expect to be emotional have generally felt unremarkable. I seem to have experienced them with relative ease. The surprises come when I'm taking a walk, talking about a silly childhood memory, or seeing an old friend. Above all, I've learned that my emotions are often hidden from myself as well as from others, and then I think that I'm done having feelings. And suddenly I learned that they lie barely below the surface, ready to emerge when I least expect them. This will not be a regular episode, but a much more personal conversation where I talk about what the past few weeks have been like for me. Since my dad died, I have released 2 episodes, both of which were recorded the day before he passed away. I thought about recording a regular episode today as well. I realized, however, that today I need to talk about my dad and what it's been like since he died of pancreatic cancer 3.5 weeks ago. On this podcast, I generally try not to talk too much about my personal life, and instead I try to address issues of importance to the Jewish world. But every once in a while, I do move in a personal direction. Incidentally, they've almost always been right after Pesach. 3 years ago, in episode 59, I spoke about my friend David Schimmel. 2 years ago, in episode 108, I talked about my father's very serious health scare over Chol HaMoed Pesach. In that episode, I said that I was discussing personal matters because, in the words of Henri Nouwen, the most personal is the most universal, the most hidden is the most public, and the most solitary is the most communal. In that spirit, today I'm going to do something similar. I'm talking about this not because I'm going through something different from everyone else, but on the contrary, this is an experience that is the most typical in the world. And the rawness of Avelut, of mourning, a rawness I've only been a part of for 3.5 weeks, and some of my poignant memories are what I hope to share with you today. People have asked me if this was expected. I've used a term that was popularized by Ernest Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, where a character describes how he went bankrupt. 2 ways: gradually, then suddenly. That's a good description of how my father died. Gradually, then suddenly. About 2.5 years ago, while we were still emerging from COVID, my parents visited Israel over Sukkot, as they often did. They stayed in a basement apartment a couple of minutes from our house, and Aliza and I would generally walk them home at night. I noticed that my father seemed older, he was walking slower, and he needed to stop several times during our walks. He told me it was his back. It wasn't his back. About 2 days after they arrived home, I found out that while he hadn't wanted to talk about it, my father was experiencing shortness of breath. After a month or 2 of testing, the medical verdict was announced. He had pancreatic cancer, which had metastasized to his lung. It wasn't something he or my mother wanted people to know about, so we kept it quiet. For those who remember that he had a pulmonary embolism 2 years ago, This diagnosis and chemotherapy were the background to that major medical event. Given the dire nature of pancreatic cancer, my father, obviously leaving aside the week he was in a coma because of the pulmonary embolism, did remarkably well. Even though he was on chemotherapy, he generally felt quite good. Although he and my mom couldn't make it to our daughter Tali's wedding to Shai, that was as much about corona as anything else. They were able to attend the weddings of 3 other grandchildren and the engagement party of a 4th. In fact, the day after our son Ephraim's wedding to Shira last May in Jerusalem, my parents and in-laws jointly hosted a Sheva Brachot. My father gave a speech where he mentioned that he had been near death a year earlier, and then he said that, in his opinion, God kept him alive so that he would be able to attend this wedding and the Sheva Brachot. Of course, afterwards I joked with him that sounded a bit like a death wish, now that the wedding and Sheva Brachot were over. I visited my parents this past August, and my dad was clearly significantly weaker than he had been previously. But he still seemed generally like himself. For example, I wanted to review some financial questions with him, and we were able to go over various bank accounts and investments for a couple of hours. He wasn't as sharp as he had been previously, but he was still very much there. Things started to change after that visit. By the time I went back in February, he was barely speaking, and frankly, he was a shadow of the strong and intelligent father with whom I grew up. In the ensuing weeks, he got weaker and weaker. When I spoke to my parents late on Wednesday night, April 10th, he didn't speak above a murmur. I didn't have any idea how close the end was then, but 2 hours later, around 4 o'clock in the morning, my brother called to tell me to check my WhatsApp messages, as my father was not responsive and was being sent to the emergency room. Half an hour after that, I listened over the phone as the doctor came out of the emergency room to tell my mother that my dad had died. I told my mother that I would call each of my siblings, which I did. I told them as matter-of-factly as I could what had happened. Whether that was the right or wrong way to do it, I don't know, but that's what I did. My sisters and brother and I decided together that while we would each tell our kids, we would not post about it even in family WhatsApp groups until we had confirmed that all of our kids had heard. After all, our son Yaki was in the army and didn't have a phone. Amy's son Ilan was on a plane from Israel to Boston. It would be pretty terrible if they found out from turning on their phones or by someone saying, "Sorry to hear about your grandfather," before they had any idea of what had happened. Things took place very quickly after that. My parents were in Florida, but the funeral was going to be in Boston. I have one sister who lives in Massachusetts, a sister who lives in White Plains, and a brother in Manhattan. Because I live in Israel, I had to very quickly buy ridiculously overpriced plane tickets to ensure that I would get to Boston in time. I was able to catch a 4:30 flight to New York on Thursday afternoon with a connecting flight to Boston. Over the next few hours before the flight, I spoke to each of my kids individually to tell them the news. I asked my siblings and the rabbi in Newton, Massachusetts, to try to have the funeral as early as possible on Friday. Early enough, that is, so that my wife and kids could watch the live stream in Israel without having to stop in the middle for Shabbos. During this time, from 4:30 in the morning on Thursday until the burial, I had the halachic status of an onain. This means that I was exempt from performing positive mitzvot, and meant that I would not be putting on my tefillin, davening, or saying any brachot. The experience was bizarre and taught me the unfortunate lesson that I don't give these brachot the thought that I should, as I found myself saying so many of them by rote without thinking about them at all. I finally arrived at my parents' house around 3:40 on Friday morning Boston time, after basically not sleeping since I had heard the news about 30 hours earlier, which itself had been only 2 hours after I'd gone to sleep. Now I had about 3 hours to try and rest, as we were leaving for the funeral at 7:30 a.m. I got up before 7, gulped down some cold coffee, and got into the car to attend a funeral for the first time. I have stood outside of many funerals. That's because I'm a Kohen, prohibited from being under the same roof as a dead body. The exceptions, when a Kohen is allowed to attend a funeral and burial, are for the 7 relatives, namely father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, and wife. And even then, only until the burial is complete. So the first funeral I ever attended inside was this one. It was a new experience to sit in the anteroom before the funeral, and then to tear my shirt on the left side over my heart after my mother, my siblings, and I recited the blessing, Dayan Ha'emet. Blessed is the true judge. It was a novel experience to be in the same room as the coffin and to sit just 2 feet away from it. I had spoken at a funeral once before. When Elisa's grandmother died, about 14 years ago, I read a eulogy while standing in the courtyard in the Beit Shemesh cemetery, outside of the structure where people sit and eulogies are typically read. My father was with me then, and as I held the paper with the words I had written, He held the microphone that would transmit my words inside. This now was my second eulogy, and this time my father would not be holding the microphone for me. The funeral took place in the Hebrew month of Nisan, the month of the Exodus from Egypt. Because Nisan is a month of celebration, Jewish law by and large prohibits one from giving a eulogy at a funeral. Nevertheless, people typically do speak at funerals, even in Nisan, and adhering to that prohibition is largely a matter of attitude. Trying to teach people about the departed's good qualities is acceptable, whereas attempting to evoke tears and crying is discouraged. The former is what I attempted to do in my remarks. Whether I was successful isn't for me to determine. I had written my non-eulogy eulogy on the plane ride from Tel Aviv to New York, and I spoke those hastily written words aloud for the first time on Friday morning as I stood up at the funeral. At some point I mentioned that he would come home from work and watch Sesame Street with us when we were little, both to spend time with us and because he really liked Sesame Street. I don't know how much thought I gave that line when I wrote it. I was operating on essentially no sleep, even as I had no desire to sleep. But I was surprised when, as I said those words, those deep emotions emerged intensely, perhaps for the first time that morning. I don't know why, of all the memories, the thought of Sesame Street somehow broke the dam. Perhaps it reminded me of my dad when he was much younger than I am now. Perhaps it reminded me of myself when I was truly little. Perhaps it reminded me of the innocence of childhood and the belief that my big and strong dad would always be there to protect me. Perhaps it reminded me of the small things that somehow always seemed to make the biggest impression. Perhaps it was all of those things, and perhaps not. We drove to the cemetery on Baker Street in West Roxbury, the same cemetery where so many Jews from Boston are buried, including Rav Soloveitchik. Once again, this was my first time inside a Jewish cemetery ever. I tried to take it in and genuinely internalize the experience. I also knew that as a Kohen, I wasn't permitted to come back inside to visit in the future either. As the burial was being completed, my brother and I said Kaddish for the first time, and then the two of us, alone, rushed outside the cemetery. The time that we were permitted to be there, now that the burial was completed, was over. We were the first ones to leave, and we waited outside for everyone else who would join us several minutes later. Then we went back to the house in which I grew up, and we began sitting Shiva. My mother, my 3 siblings, and I. I never understood before how therapeutic and comforting Shiva is. Beloved family members drove in from far away to comfort us. Friends who knew and loved my dad came from places like New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Minneapolis, Washington, Boca Raton, Cleveland, and more. This was an opportunity for all of us to remember how much we all loved my dad. If, a week before Shiva, you had asked me to describe my father, to name some dominant characteristics, for example, I probably would have said something like, I don't know, he's just a great dad. Shiva forced us to articulate some of what made him the person that he was, as well as to remember, or even hear for the first time, stories about him that would otherwise have been relegated to the recesses of our memories. Because of speaking and listening during Shiva, I can talk now about how generous a person my dad was. Someone spoke quietly to me on the last day of Shiva and talked about his generosity. He mentioned that he can't even tell me some of the stories he knows where my father helped people out privately in order to respect those people's privacy. He was able to tell me one story that he was personally involved in when he mentioned that the computer system where he worked was not working properly. And my dad said to him, he'll just loan him an extra computer that he had, and he hoped that that would be helpful. When this person asked my dad when he wanted it back, my father simply said, when I need it back, I'll ask for it back. The person ended up using the computer for the entire year. And when I heard that, it brought me back to an earlier time before my dad got sick. And I was able to think, that's right. That's right. Dad was really generous with people. I haven't thought about that for a while, but that's really true. Or about the fact that he volunteered his time to an almost extreme degree. It had always been part of what he did, and growing up I never thought about how remarkable that was, such as the fact that the rabbi of our shul asked him to be the president of the newly reconstituted Synagogue Council of Massachusetts over 40 years ago. So my dad did it. This was a volunteer position, and it took a lot of his time. I have no idea why he was asked to do it or why anyone assumed that he was qualified for it. But somehow my dad was president of the Synagogue Council of Massachusetts, and I know that he did a great job. As I recall, one of his many initiatives there was to encourage Jewish people to volunteer in Boston soup kitchens over Christian holidays so that the regular workers there could spend Christmas or Easter home with their families. Under his leadership, the Jewish Cemetery Association of Massachusetts was also founded It was created when my father and others realized that because many Jews had moved out of certain communities where they had lived for the first half of the 20th century, old cemeteries in those neighborhoods were abandoned and left to the elements and to vandalism. In the words of that organization's website, JCAM was established in 1984 out of the need to ensure the Jewish community, the continuity of Jewish cemetery management would continue long after the original burial societies were unable to care for the cemeteries. It all began with 17 Jewish cemeteries, 5 of which were abandoned. Today, JCAM cares for more than 125 of the 222 known Jewish cemeteries in Massachusetts. My dad was an integral part of starting that organization. The fact that he was a Kohen who never stepped foot in those cemeteries makes his serious involvement even more remarkable. Someone else told me about the fact that my dad had been in charge of the endowment fund for a local organization. He did this for decades, and his philosophy always was to protect the principle of the endowment fund, even if that meant settling for lower returns by investing in less risky ventures. He volunteered because my great-uncle, knowing his intelligence and prudence, asked him to run this endowment fund. So he did. He did it for years with no problem and no controversy. At some point about 20 years ago or so, some new members of this organization's board suggested that my father was not earning enough money through these investments and that he needed to up his game, so to speak. My father answered that he had earned 8%, but apparently some others believed that he should be earning closer to 12%. My father, however, refused to budge. He said that they could do what they wanted, but if he remained in charge, he would not enter into what he felt were unsafe investments, even if that meant earning less money for the organization. The person who told me this story said to me that my dad's opponents were lambasting him. He told me it was brutal. My mother told me that my father wasn't particularly upset about this, even though he was being essentially yelled at for something that he had done as a volunteer for decades just because he wouldn't give in to this pressure. My father said if they wanted to replace him as the head of this endowment fund, that was fine with him. He didn't mind, but he wouldn't do something while he was in charge of it that he felt was foolish when it wasn't even his money. In the end, I believe that there was a compromise where my dad would continue to invest half of the endowment fund, and the other half would be invested by someone who was convinced that he could do better than my dad. Perhaps not surprisingly, the end of the story is that the other half of the endowment fund that my dad did not control ended up being a victim of the Madoff scandal, while my dad's half continued to produce good and safe returns. The person who told me this story concluded by saying, "That's why your dad will always be a hero." Somewhere along the line, my father became a major bar mitzvah teacher for people in Newton. I'm proud that I was his first student, and for months he and I prepared for my bar mitzvah, Parshat Noach in 1983, using any time that we could to practice. He used certain tricks to remind me not to go on autopilot. For example, there were certain words that I would habitually get incorrect, so before each of them, he would move his finger to get my attention so that I would be aware that it was coming up and avoid making the mistake. The week before my bar mitzvah, I remember being nervous as my father and I went through the laning one last time. And this time, I did it pretty well. After we finished, my father said to me something like this: "Okay, Scott, you just did a great job. You and I both know that you know this laning cold. You're going to do great on Shabbos, but that doesn't even matter anymore. You and I know that you know the Torah reading perfectly." That was exactly what I needed to hear. Anything else after this didn't really make a difference because my father and I knew, even if no one else did, that I was ready and I knew it. My dad knew what I needed to hear, and what I needed to hear in order to be more relaxed were those exact words. The kindness and love that my dad showed me, the fact that we had done this together, and we were ready, was more important to me than how I did that coming Shabbat. But as I said, later on, after I was out of the house, my father started teaching neighborhood kids for their bar mitzvahs. Again, he refused to be paid a penny for it, and only later, at my mother's suggestion, he told people who asked how they could pay him that they could make a donation to my yeshiva. But he did this because he liked to study with kids, and because he liked to teach laning, and because he was simply a giving person. After Mincha on Shabbos afternoons, he would stay in the shul and learn with his most recent student. One of them drove up to the Shiva from Queens, where he now lives. He told me that he and my father would first practice for his bar mitzvah, then they would just talk. In fact, he shared with me the inscription that my father had written in the tikkun that he had bought for him. I think my father always bought his students a tikkun before they started learning together. The inscription reads, "To David, with this tikkun, we'll work together, we'll learn together, and we'll have fun together. Fondly, Bob." A friend sent me a message during Shiva mentioning that in the shul where her husband is the rabbi, one of the main laners is from Newton, She asked him who his bar mitzvah teacher had been, and he answered that it was Bob Kahn. She noted that this means that the love of reading the Torah that my father inculcated in these kids was flowering in synagogues far away from Newton, Massachusetts. My father was obviously a great teacher. I knew that, my siblings knew that, and his bar mitzvah students knew that. He had that natural patience, along with a very impressive storehouse of knowledge. I don't know where he picked everything up, but he just seemed to know so many things. At the Shiva, someone who babysat us when we were little, and now is one of my mother's closest friends, explained how when she was in college, she needed help with her organic chemistry homework. So she called my dad, and he, of course, without charging anything, became her organic chemistry tutor. I didn't even know he knew anything about organic chemistry, but there you go. His intelligence was something that I knew about and took for granted, but I didn't really think about it too much. My sister reminded me of a story from my father's days when he worked as a consultant in the computer department of a company in Boston called Jordan Marsh. Back in those days, computers were huge machines that cost millions of dollars and were kept in special air-conditioned rooms, and many people would use that one computer in the company at the same time. Around 1976, Jordan Marsh asked my father to create a program that would convert the DOS operating system to OS. If I'm using the wrong terminology for those people who know better, please forgive me. It's definitely possible because, unfortunately, I did not inherit the computer gene from my dad. My dad told them that converting it this way was simply impossible. It could not be done. Someone from Jordan Marsh told him, well, IBM was able to do it. My father was dumbfounded. The whole concept was impossible. How could IBM have figured out something that wasn't in the realm of possibility? He ruminated over the problem for some time. I don't know for how long. But eventually, as my sister told me the story, he was sitting at the dinner table when suddenly his eyes lit up. I've got it, he said. He had finally figured out how IBM had done it. Then it was just a matter of writing up the program and implementing this realization in practice. He brought the finished product into Jordan Marsh, and they were thrilled. It worked great. But here's the kicker. It turns out that IBM had not figured it out. I don't know if someone said that to him to motivate my father, or else that person made a mistake, or even simply assumed that IBM had done it. But once my father thought that it was possible, even though it actually had never been done before, he was able to create something that had never been done before. He named his program Focus, and it became the product he used to build his own computer company, RK Computer, RK as in Robert Kahn. Some years later, he was in negotiations to sell his company, which was really just him, a salesperson, and at any given time, 1 or 2 employees, to a large computer company called Computer Associates. Just as they were nearing the finish line in the negotiations to sell the company, my father's father, my grandfather, passed away. Part of the deal with Computer Associates was that my dad was going to fly down to their headquarters on Long Island whenever they needed him over the first year of the deal. But now my father would be saying Kaddish. So part of that deal became that his upcoming work for Computer Associates could not interfere with his ability to get to Minyan 3 times a day. You see, my dad was committed to saying Kaddish, and he always took his commitment seriously. Whether it was giving as much time as needed to help his bar mitzvah students, or helping people in the community, or ensuring that he would always be able to say Kaddish, if he took on a commitment, he kept it. Of course, he did so with a smile and a good sense of humor. I still remember one time driving with him to shul towards the beginning of when he was saying Kaddish. I was a kid. He mentioned that he hoped I would be okay with the shul that we were going to attend that one day, as they sometimes were pretty lenient in terms of the age of the people whom they allowed to make up the minyan. When I asked him what he meant, he said that sometimes the shul would allow kids to make up the 10 men necessary. Was I okay with that? I told him I didn't care. I was 13 years old. If it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. When we got to the shul, he winked at me. He and I were by far the youngest people in the shul. It was just my dad having some fun with his gullible kid. On the last day he said Kaddish for my grandfather, however, my father got quite emotional, which was very atypical for him. He almost never wore his emotions on his sleeve. In the car ride home from Shachrit, I asked him what was going on. He told me that for the past 11 months, he felt like he had been holding my grandfather's hand when he said Kaddish. Now that he was done saying Kaddish, he explained, he felt like he was letting go of my grandfather's hand and saying, "Okay, Dad, you're on your own." I think that's an exact quote. You know, it might be that my strongest memories of my father are car rides like that one, when we would be together by ourselves and we would talk. Of course, one of the most memorable car rides wasn't even one where we had a real conversation. When I was in first grade, he drove me to school 2 days a week, along with 2 other first graders and a third grader. Apparently, every day we youngins would talk about what shirt we were wearing. I'm wearing a Red Sox shirt, I'm wearing a Charlie Brown shirt, or whatever. My dad, who back then wore a tie and jacket to work every day, would interject that he was wearing his clown shirt. When we asked him if we could see it, he said, sure, as soon as we get to school, he would show us. And every day, when we got to school, there would apparently never be enough time to show us his clown shirt. This went on for the entire year of first grade. The last day of school, my father was waiting for us to start talking about what shirts we were wearing. But apparently we were all very quiet. So this time, he started the conversation, telling us that he was, again, wearing his clown shirt. We were smart enough that after months of hearing this, we knew that there was no clown shirt. I still remember saying, sure, Dad, and not believing it one bit. Then we got to school, we all got out of the car, and we started walking into the school building. At that point, my dad called out to us, guys. We turned around to look. My dad dramatically turned around, lowered his sports jacket, and there, on the back of his shirt, were pictures of clowns. The third grader's jaw dropped. She pointed and said, he's wearing a clown shirt! He's wearing a clown shirt! Apparently, the night before, my father sat with my mother, cut out clown pictures from a coloring book, and pinned them on his shirt. My dad loved that story, and he especially loved the third grader's reaction. And at the Shiva, the third grader, who is no longer a third grader, told that story again. There were so many other ways that he was a great and fun dad. Until I was 13 years old, we used to go to Grossinger's for Pesach every year in the Catskills. One year I joined a ping pong tournament. I was doing well, and then in the middle of the tournament, an adult joined and in the finals beat me. I was really upset. After all, he skipped the first rounds and for no reason got a free pass into a later round. The employee who was in charge of the tournament realized I was upset and walked me and my father to a closet where they kept the small plaques that they gave out to the winners of the ping pong tournaments. He gave one to me. I actually found it in my old bedroom during Shiva and brought it back with me to Israel. Later on, I realized, of course, he gave it to me because my father must have asked him to do so. But my dad never said that to me. But again, I think my fondest memories are those long car rides we had together where we would just talk about stuff. In my eulogy, I talked about the two of us driving to Arlington, Massachusetts to buy donuts on many Sunday mornings, and about our drives from Delray Beach to Orlando or from Boston to the Catskills. What did we talk about? There are two answers to that question. The first answer is we talked about everything. The second answer, which is much more painful for me, is that I don't really remember. I don't know what we talked about. I remember how great it was. I remember how much I enjoyed those rides. But I can't tell you many specifics of what we said. Hours and hours of conversations, and they're gone. I don't remember the vast majority of the details. That's one of the most painful realizations. I'm never going to find out what we said, and we're not going to have any car rides anymore. I think this sense of forgetting may be one of the most intense experiences of Avelut for me, and I'm sure for many others as well. Chazal anticipated this in Masechet Temurah 16a, which reads, when Moshe was about to pass away into the Garden of Eden, he said to Joshua, ask me any questions that you have. Joshua answered, my teacher, have I ever left you for a moment to go somewhere else? Did you not write in the Torah, his servant Joshua would not leave the tent? When Moshe died, Joshua forgot 300 points of Jewish law, and he thought of 700 questions to which he did not know the answers. In other words, while Moshe was alive, Joshua was sure that he knew everything Moshe had taught him. And moments after Moshe died, Joshua thought of 1,000 points that were unclear, and now it was too late. This story was told by Rav, the same person, in fact, whose story opened today's podcast. It was after Rav's funeral when his students stopped to eat at the river Danak and tried to figure out the laws of making brachot. And when he realized that Rav was no longer there to answer their questions, Rav Ada bar Ahava got up and tore his cloak a second time, saying poignantly, Rav is gone, and we haven't even learned how to make brachot. I think it's noteworthy that Rav discussed Joshua's forgetting what he learned from Moshe, and Rav's students, in turn, talked about forgetting what they had learned from Rav. Forgetting the details after someone dies, apparently, is a universal and inescapable part of the mourning process. No matter how much we learn from someone, it's never enough. We're always going to forget. While forgetting is tragic, it's also necessary in order for us to move forward in life without being permanently shackled to the past. Rav, again, says in Masechet Brachot 58b that the dead is not forgotten from the heart until after 12 months have passed. There is a time to remember, and there is a time we must allow ourselves to forget, and to forgive ourselves for forgetting. Forgetting specific memories is inevitable. What we might not like to think about, but is equally true, is that forgetting a person altogether is also sadly inevitable. Dr. Erica Brown talked about Megillat Kohelet in episode 176 of this podcast. She referred to a passage in her book, Kohelet and the Search for Meaning, which reads as follows. We are haunted by the prospect of non-existence. David Eagleman, in Some 40 Tales of the Afterlife, observes that the process of forgetting the dead is incremental. Quote, there are 3 deaths. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. The third is that moment, sometime in the future, when your name is spoken for the last time. Dr. Brown observes that this is the saddest time of all. If we forget the details, if the person himself begins to be forgotten after 12 months, if there comes a time when a person's name is spoken for the last time, what was the point of it all? What was the purpose of a life if it's ultimately completely swept away? I'd like to offer 5 brief approaches that I have considered over the past few weeks. First, as religious people who have a relationship with God, an eternal covenant with God, we believe that his promise to us should not and will not end at the grave, that something more lies beyond it. As Rabbi Dr. Abraham Heschel asserted, that something compared to life in our physical world is akin to the comparison between melody and violin, or time and calendar. The world in which we exist feels like the ultimate reality, but we assert that this world is a vessel for a much greater reality that transcends it. Second, as my teacher Rabbi Moshe Simkovich wrote to me, the memory of a person is there because it is incorporated into your person. How a death reverberates in a descendant is a lens focused on how the life reverberated, and will do so again and again, even beyond 12 months. I understand him to mean that the specific memories we have are secondary to the impression that a life well lived has on our existence, and those reverberations affect everything that we do, regardless of whether we do so consciously or otherwise. Third, the bonds of love that exist are stronger than death. As I said at the funeral, when we are tied together with bonds of love, we carry those bonds with us every day, and they survive even when one of us is no longer here. Genuine love is too strong to be eliminated by the grave. Something more powerful than death. The unity of hearts united in love continues living forever. Fourth, we believe in a concept called Zechut Avot, that is, the merit of our ancestors, which accompanies us in the present. This was an idea that my father believed in strongly. He told me more than once that he had lived a wonderful life, and he believed that the reason was because of the goodness of his parents and grandparents. By carrying that belief with him, he could look at what God gave him every day and be thankful. And he could also carry the knowledge that his ancestors were part of what he experienced. Finally, the ineffable name of God, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, implies his eternity. That, in turn, means that while human beings are swept along an irreversible timeline, God is always watching each moment of that timeline. For God, what happened in the past is taking place right now as well. My memories, in the mind of the Absolute, are not memories. They're taking place today. This may be the idea behind saying Yizkor, which we recite 4 times a year, including on the last day of Pesach. That was my first time saying Yizkor, and as I recited the words, Yizkor Elokim Nishmat Avimori Yisrael ben Nachum Zeva Kohen Shehalach Lolamo. May God remember the soul of my father who has gone to his eternal home. I thought about the idea that while we forget, God never forgets. That while someone's name will eventually be forgotten in our world, it will never be forgotten by God. That while a life may be finished in the realm of the physical, it exists eternally in the memory of God. That somehow, in some way, those wonderful memories that recede for human beings continue to exist in the divine mind. That thought made me think of the last words of A.A. Milne's The House at Pooh Corner, as Christopher Robin talks to Pooh about growing up. Pooh, when I'm not doing nothing, will you come up here sometimes? Just me? Yes, Pooh. Will you be here too? Yes, Pooh, I will be, really. I promise I will be, Pooh. That's good, said Pooh. Pooh, promise you won't forget about me ever, not even when I'm 100. Pooh thought for a little. How old shall I be then? 99. Pooh nodded. I promise, he said. Still with his eyes on the world, Christopher Robin put out a hand and felt for Pooh's paw. Pooh, said Christopher Robin earnestly, if I'm not quite... He stopped and tried again. Pooh, whatever happens, you will understand, won't you? Understand what? Oh, nothing. He laughed and jumped to his feet. Come on. Where? Said Pooh. Anywhere, said Christopher Robin. So they went off together. But wherever they go, and whatever happens to them on the way, in that enchanted place on the top of the forest, a little boy and his bear will always be playing. Today, this reminds me of me and my dad. A great dad. A dad who loved my mother. A dad who loved my sisters and brother. A dad who loved so many people. A dad who was loved by so many people. A dad who loved me, Eliza, and our kids, and we loved him. A dad about whom I can say the same thing that he said about his own parents, that so many of the wonderful things in my life, I'm sure, are a result of his goodness. A dad for whom I'll say Kaddish every day, and as he felt that he was holding his father's hand, I'll try to feel the same. A dad with whom I shared amazing memories, but whose impact is even stronger than those memories. A dad whom I remember. A dad whom God remembers. That's why I know that in that enchanted place, somewhere else in time and space, a little boy and his dad will always be playing. I'm Scott Kahn, and this has been The Orthodox Conundrum.